Hello, my name is Ava Cruz, and today we're going to look beyond the boardwalk to analyze the environmental and economic impacts of beach replenishment projects on the New Jersey coast. Beach replenishment projects have become the usual response to a changing coastline, but it's a tricky mix of engineering, massive taxpayer spending, and delicate coastal ecology. Over the course of this presentation, we will look beyond the surface level at these engineered beaches. We'll examine the historical context of these projects, the direct environmental concerns they cause, the core federal and state environmental statutes that govern them, and the intense legal and local battles over funding and public access that follow the sand. To begin, let's define what beach replenishment actually is. Put simply, it's a massive engineering process where millions of cubic yards of sand are dredged up from the offshore ocean floor and pumped right onto our eroded coastlines through heavy pipelines, just like the photo that you see here. But why do we have to keep doing this? The core problem comes down to a mix of climate change, rising sea levels, and increasingly severe coastal storms. These elements speed up our beaches getting washed away. Historically, New Jersey has relied on this kind of artificial beach building since the late 20th century and essentially treats the beaches like a dynamic, ongoing infrastructure project that requires maintenance. Now, let's look at a major real-world case study happening right now, what has been called the 2026 Emergency Blitz. This year, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers had to launch a massive $99 million emergency project along the South Jersey shore. The cause of this massive mobilization was a series of severe coastal storms and accelerated erosion. These storms left several local beach towns with dangerously narrow shores, creating immediate structural risks to our coastal infrastructure, specifically boardwalks and seawalls that protect multi-million-dollar property blocks. As you can see from the map, the scope of this project is huge, focusing heavily on major tourism hotspots, including Ocean City, Strathmere, Sea Isle City, Avalon, and Stone Harbor. Pulling this off requires an enormous amount of heavy maritime construction equipment, highlighting just how aggressive and costly our immediate response to coastal erosion has become. To truly understand the massive scale of this emergency operation, let's look at the actual breakdown of funding versus physical sand volume across these specific coastal zones. On the left, the blue chart tracks the emergency funding contracts announced by the Army Corps and Representative Van Drew. Sea Isle City and Strathmere received the largest individual contract at $21.6 million, followed closely by Ocean City at $19.5 million, and the Avalon and Stone Harbor combined zone at $15.8 million. But when we look at the orange chart on the right, measuring the physical sand being moved, we see the Sea Isle and Strathmere require the highest volume of physical sand, requiring 1.9 million cubic yards for their shores. Ocean City required about 1.6 million, and Avalon and Stone Harbor took just over 1.1 million. This comparison shows that sand volume and dollar amounts track closely here, as the areas experiencing the most severe storm erosion required both the material and the largest chunk of the federal disaster funding. Now that we have looked at the massive scale and the financial costs of these projects, let's dive into why beach replenishment is a major environmental concern. First, we have to look at the ecological impact on the benthic community, which is a scientific term for the organisms living at the bottom of the ocean floor. When massive dredging machines vacuum up sand from the offshore borrow zones, they do not just take sand. They instantly destroy the habitats of marine worms, clams, and the small crabs like the ones pictured here. This leads directly to a severe trickle-down effect on our local coastal food web. When you wipe out these bottom-dwelling organisms, you are essentially erasing the primary food source for local coastal fish and migrating shorebirds that depend on a high-protein diet to survive and reproduce. Finally, the physical act of dumping and moving all this sand causes massive issues with muddiness and choking, known scientifically as turbidity. The dislodged fine sediment creates thick, muddy water. This floating silt can physically choke local fish gills and cloud up water so badly that it blocks out the critical sunlight needed for underwater marine plants to grow. So while the beach looks clean and expansive to tourists on the surface, beneath the waves it completely disrupts the local ecosystem. Moving from the hidden biology beneath the waves, let's look at the highly visible footprint left on our coastlines. People often forget that beach replenishment is a 24/7 heavy construction zone. As you can see in this nighttime photo, heavy machinery and massive dredging vessels operate around the clock. This creates continuous noise and light pollution, which heavily disrupts nocturnal marine life and nesting coastal birds along our shores. Beyond the wildlife, these projects directly conflict with the human element of environmental policy through public access closures. Because pumping sand is dangerous work, the Army Corps has to close off massive 1,000-foot moving sections of the public beach. When this happens during peak tourism seasons, it blocks residents and visitors from accessing a shared natural resource, which causes a lot of local friction. But the most frustrating piece of this puzzle is what environmental economists call the Sisyphus paradox, named after the Greek myth of a man forced to roll a boulder up a hill for eternity, only to watch it roll back down. Because beach replenishment is entirely an artificial fix, it is fundamentally temporary. A single coastal storm can wash away a $20 million project in a matter of days. This traps us in an endless, unsustainable loop of throwing millions of dollars of taxpayer money right back into the ocean. Now that we have looked at the science and the heavy machinery, who is actually calling the shots? Coastal management on the Jersey Shore relies on a complex network of key players and stakeholders operating at every level. At the top, we have the federal level. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers acts as the primary muscle. They handle the massive engineering design, deploy the maritime construction equipment, and secure the bulk of the federal emergency funding. Next is the state level, managed by the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. The state acts as a regulatory gatekeeper, handling environmental compliance permits, making sure the project does not completely violate local wildlife laws, and organizing state-level funding matches. Then the pressure rolls down to our local municipalities. Coastal mayors and city councils are caught in a tough spot. They have to constantly advocate for federal help to save their beaches, but they also have to scrape together a mandatory local match of millions of local taxpayer dollars to clear their portion of the contract. Finally, we have our private contractors and public consumers. Private industrial dredging companies like Norfolk Dredging or Great Lakes Dredge and Dock are awarded these multi-million-dollar contracts to physically execute the work. And waiting at the very end of this chain are the tourists and local businesses. Moving along, let's look at the legal framework that governs all of this. Because beach replenishment involves massive environmental disruption and federal dollars, it is heavily regulated by 3 major environmental statutes. The first is a federal policy, the Coastal Zone Management Act. This is the law that actually provides the federal matching funds that fuel our endless loop of pumping sand. But it comes with a catch called federal consistency. This rule forces the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to align its massive federal engineering projects with New Jersey-specific state-level coastal management and environmental goals. The second statute is local, New Jersey's Coastal Area Facility Review Act. This is the reason why these construction projects look the way they do on these beaches. It requires contractors to work in smaller, moving blocks to minimize public beach closures. However, while it tries to manage the public impact, it ultimately greenlights this massive industrial disruption year after year because coastal protection is deemed a critical priority. Finally, we have the Federal Clean Water Act. This plays a massive role in managing the underwater ecological damage we talked about earlier. Under Section 401, the project requires a strict water quality certification. This law forces the Army Corps to constantly monitor sediment and turbidity levels in the water, and it legally requires them to pause pumping operations if local wildlife habitats or water quality standards are severely threatened. The reality is that the Clean Water Act acts as an active legal referee, but it is reactive. Pumping millions of cubic yards of sand is inherently dirty, industrial work. This law forces the Army Corps to constantly monitor sediment levels and legally requires them to pause operations when the silt gets too hazardous. But by the time that the referee blows the whistle and hits the shutdown button, the muddy plume has already spread, and local habitats have already been impacted. So while the Clean Water Act is actively in motion trying to minimize the ecological fallout, it highlights the constant, messy compromise between rushing to protect beach property and trying to defend a fragile marine ecosystem. While the statutes set the ground rules on paper, the actual execution of beach replenishment frequently sparks intense legal action and municipal litigation. First, we see a clash over private property rights. For the Army Corps to build protective dunes, they often need to access private oceanfront land. In several New Jersey towns, wealthy oceanfront homeowners flat out refuse to sign what are called easements, the legal permissions allowing the government onto their property. This forced local municipalities to step in and use eminent domain, which is a controversial legal process where the government seizes private property for public use. Unsurprisingly, this has triggered waves of high-stake lawsuits over property rights and fair compensation. The second battleground involves public access versus public funding. If a town accepts millions of dollars in federal taxpayer-funded sand, they are legally required to provide sufficient public access, bathrooms, and parking so everyone can enjoy that beach, not just people living on it. Local advocacy groups and organizations like the American Littoral Society have used severe legal pressure and lawsuits to hold towns accountable, ensuring municipalities don't try to restrict public access to what is fundamentally a taxpayer-funded natural resource. Finally, we have the battle of challenging dredging permits. Environmental advocates and conservation groups regularly use administrative appeals and legal action to challenge the permits issued by the NJDEP. Their goal is usually to pause or completely halt dredging operations when they take place too close to sensitive marine habitats, fish spawning grounds, or nesting shorebirds. Ultimately, this shows that beach replenishment isn't just an engineering challenge. It is a nonstop, multi-front legal conflict between private owners, public citizens, and environmental defenders. Now that we've looked at the staggering financial costs, the severe ecological disruptions, and the nonstop legal battles surrounding traditional beach replenishment, the obvious question is there a better way forward? Fortunately, environmental scientists and coastal engineers are developing innovative, sustainable alternatives to the endless cycle of pumping offshore sand. The first solution focuses on dune stabilization. Instead of just piling up bare sand and waiting for a storm to take it, we can plant native vegetation like beach grass or switchgrass paired with a strategic sand fencing. The deep interlocking root systems of these plants physically secure the sand in place, while the fences naturally trap wind-blown particles, allowing the dunes to grow and strengthen organically over time. Next, we can look below the surface at living reefs. This involves deploying eco-friendly concrete structures, often called oyster castles, oyster shell bags, or recycled wire cages. Unlike traditional harsh seawalls, these living reefs are submerged offshore to physically break incoming wave energy before it violently hits the beach, while simultaneously creating a thriving habitat that attracts local marine life. Further, a really fascinating technology and innovation is the use of recycled glass sand. Companies like Cyanere have developed a process to crush recycled glass into a fine, eco-friendly powder that behaves exactly like natural sand. Using this material allows us to build up beaches using municipal waste, completely eliminating the need to vacuum up and destroy offshore marine habitats. To conclude our look at coastal management along the Jersey Shore, we have to look toward building a smarter shoreline. First, we must acknowledge the Sisyphus paradox. Traditional beach replenishment, as we've seen, operates as a reactive, multi-million-dollar band-aid. While it temporarily protects critical tourism infrastructure and boardwalk business for a summer season, it fundamentally cannot withstand major coastal storms and washes away in a matter of days. Second, our policy priorities must evolve. Environmental regulations are already in place to force decision makers to evaluate these heavy ecological costs, like benthic habitat destruction and wildlife disruption, against short-term economic gains. These laws remind us that our economy cannot be separated from our ecology. Ultimately, a sustainable path forward for protecting New Jersey's coastal communities requires a major transition. We must shift away from disruptive industrial dredging operations and move toward proactive, nature based engineering. By investing in living reefs, organic dune stabilization, and alternative sand sourcing like recycled glass, we can protect our shores for generations to come. Thank you.